Every time some right-wing talking head on TV wants to sound very serious about how society is crumbling, they break out the phrase identity politics. A politician loses urban voters, must be identity politics. A university lets students form an LGBTQ+ group and a black student union? Identity politics. A corporation puts more than one person of color in a commercial? Identity politics gone mad. If you listen to cable news, you'd think identity politics was invented by a gender studies major on TikTok somewhere around 2015, probably the same week they canceled plastic straws, Christmas, and traditional values all in one group chat. But the origins of the term go back quite a bit farther and have history that would make those right-wing talking heads even more angry about it, because it was coined by a group of exhausted black lesbians in 1970s Boston. Forget the text at the bottom of the screen, forget the panel show. I want you to picture a cramped apartment living room in Boston, Roxbury, the South End, someplace where landlords don't come quickly and cops come even slower. And when they do come, it's usually not to help the people that live there. Secondhand couch, ashtray overflowing, someone's kid's toy shoved in a corner, a folding card table doing its best as a desk. Actually, it kind of sounds a lot like my apartment. Around it, a small group of black women, most of them lesbians, many of them socialists, some working class, some middle class, some juggling jobs and kids and organizing and trying to pay rent in a city that treats them at best as an afterthought and at worst as the enemy. The television in the corner is probably reporting on busing or school desegregation, or another politician explaining why budget cuts are inevitable. But the volume is off. On the table in front of them, stacks of paper, pens, coffee that is 80% caffeine and 20% rage. They're trying to do something incredibly simple and incredibly radical at the same time. Put into words a politics that actually describes how they live. Not the life of the white middle-class feminist whose big battle is getting out of the house and into a corner office. Not the life of the black male activist who assumes women will type the flyers and make the coffee while he gives the speeches. Not the life of the respectable white gay man who assumes racism is a separate committee's problem. Their lives. Lives where race, gender, sexuality, and class don't show up as tidy separate bullet points. They show up all at once, in the same body, in the same day. The boss who pays you less and calls you girl, the cop who harasses your brother and ignores the murders of black women in your neighborhood, the women's group where they say sisterhood, but they mean white sisterhood and look confused when you bring up racism. Every movement they walk into, civil rights, feminism, the socialist left, gay liberation, has the same basic message in slightly different packaging. We're all in this together, as long as this is about the oppression we've already decided matters most. We'll get to your thing later. Later never comes. So these women decide, fine, we're going to write this down. We're going to make a statement, a manifesto. They can hand this out to anyone who asks what they're doing or why they're so divisive or why they won't just pick a lane and stay in it. They're going to define their own politics on their own terms. They call themselves the Combahee River Collective, which sounds poetic, right? Like maybe it's the name of a pretty place in New England with foliage and a covered bridge. Think again. The Combahee River is in South Carolina, and if you know your Civil War history, you know exactly why that name is not cute. It's a warning. In June of 1863, Harriet Tubman, who white children's books like to describe as a kindly conductor on the Underground Railroad, as if she was just quietly punching tickets in the night, led an actual military raid up the Combahee River with Union gunboats. She gathered intelligence from enslaved people, coordinated with Union officers, and in a single night helped liberate more than 700 enslaved people as plantations burned behind them. She was the first woman to lead an armed assault in the Civil War. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for the men in charge to feel ready. She planned an exit route, and then she took people with her. So when these black feminists in Boston in the 1970s sit around that living room and say, we're going to call ourselves the Combahee River Collective, they are making a very clear statement. We are not here to be your footnote. We're here to figure out what liberation looks like when we are at the center of it. We are the political descendants of a black woman who literally planned and led a liberation raid. And if that freaks you out, good, you're paying attention. We've been in this neighborhood before. In the last episode of the podcast, we talked about Quaker women in New England standing up in wooden meeting houses and insisting that God might be speaking through them, not just through the men with the titles. For that, they were whipped, jailed, and in some cases executed. Fast forward a few centuries and 100 or so miles, and we've got black lesbian socialists in Boston who aren't appealing to an inner light, but they are saying something just as dangerous to the status quo. Our lived experience is enough. Our lives are evidence. We don't need your permission, your theory, or your approval to decide what justice should look like. Quaker women claimed the authority to speak religious truth. The Combahee River Collective claimed the authority to speak political truth. This episode is not about a buzzword on Fox News. It's about what happens when a group of black women in 1970s Boston name the pattern that's been hiding in plain sight and write it down. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Bitchy History. Welcome to No One Is Coming to Save Us, the Combahee River Collective.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Before we head back into that Boston living room, we need to talk about the world outside the door. On paper, the 1970s looks like the golden age of liberation movements. The civil rights movement has forced the country to confront Jim Crow, Black Power, anti-war protests, women's lib, gay lib, student uprisings. If you watch the montage version, it looks like everyone is getting free together. Up close, it's messier. Second-wave feminism is in full swing. Women are suing over job discrimination, demanding the right to birth control and abortion, opening rape crisis centers and shelters. White women leaving violent marriages or suffocating suburban lives are doing something genuinely risky and brave in a legal system that still protects husbands more than wives. Marital rape is still legal in many states. Banks can and do deny women credit in their own names. Having it all is not just a glossy magazine slogan. For many women, it's the difference between staying trapped and imagining an exit. But the public face of that feminism, the books, the talk shows, the most visible leaders, is all overwhelmingly white, college-educated, and middle class. The universal woman being described looks suspiciously like a white woman whose problems are framed around frustration with domesticity, glass ceilings, and sexual repression. If you're a black woman working 2 jobs, or a Puerto Rican woman dealing with racist doctors, or a poor white woman whose life has never even pretended to offer a single breadwinner fantasy, you might recognize some of this, and not all of it. When you bring up racism or poverty, the room often goes a bit quiet. Someone says sincerely, "Of course, that's important, but we're trying to focus on just women's issues here." Meanwhile, in civil rights and Black Power spaces, the picture flips. Black women are everywhere in these movements. They're organizing meetings, running voter registration drives, raising money, cooking for activists, editing newsletters, giving speeches, strategizing campaigns. Without them, nothing works. But when it's time to write the manifesto or stand at the microphone, men's voices often dominate. The unofficial script says, first we defeat racism and imperialism, then we'll sort out sexism and homophobia. In practice, later is a very elastic concept. If you're a black woman, especially a lesbian in these circles, and you bring up the way women are sidelined or the homophobia that makes you have to hide part of yourself in meetings, you might be told that you're creating division. You're essential, but your comfort is negotiable. Gay liberation after Stonewall looks like a breath of fresh air. People are coming out, forming organizations, marching, but those organizations are often dominated by white men. Lesbians have to fight to be taken seriously at all. Queer and trans people of color run into racism inside the very movements that talk about liberation. If you're a black lesbian trying to be politically active in the 1970s and you do the full tour, Civil Rights Meeting Monday, Women's Group Tuesday, Socialist Collective Wednesday, Lesbian Group Thursday, you're hearing a version of the same instruction every time. Please leave parts of yourself at the door. We'll return them when we're done changing the world. This isn't a brand new problem. Black women have been naming it for generations. Sojourner Truth stands up in 1851 and asks, in essence, where do I fit in your definition of a woman? Anna Julia Cooper writes in the 1890s that when and where black women enter, the whole race enters with them. Ida B. Wells documents lynching and calls out white women who allow myths about protecting womanhood to fuel racial terror. Black women organize for suffrage, education, healthcare, and anti-lynching campaigns, constantly navigating white women's racism and black men's sexism. Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer in the mid-20th century build and sustain the civil rights movement while questioning its hierarchies. For over a century, black women have been saying, your race-only politics don't see me, your sex-only politics don't either. By the time we get to Boston in the mid-1970s, that frustration has a long history behind it. And Boston itself is not a neutral space. This is a city that loves to tell stories about abolitionists, freedom trails, and righteous New England conscience, but it's also a place of vicious school desegregation fights, racist housing policies, and feminist spaces that are often as white as the snow in their fundraising brochures. In our last episode, Quaker women in this region were fighting to be heard in meeting houses, insisting that their inner light made them spiritual equals. In the 1970s, Black women in Boston are walking into progressive women's centers, looking around at who's on the walls, who's running the show, and thinking, we helped build this house. How did we end up locked in the basement? That's the maze that the Combahee River Collective is born into. Not a lack of movements, but a surplus of them, all allergic to the full complexity of Black women's lives. Before there's Combahee, there's NBFO, the National Black Feminist Organization, founded in New York in 1973. For Black women who felt squeezed out of both white feminism and Black nationalism, NBFO is a revelation. It says plainly that Black women need our own political space. That race-only and sex-only frameworks aren't cutting it. Boston women, including Barbara Smith, her twin sister Beverly, and Demita Frazier, connect with NBFO and form a local chapter. They go to conferences, meet Black feminists from other cities, and experience that dizzying relief of realizing you are not, in fact, the only person seeing what you see. For a while, that's enough. They read, talk, and organize under the NBFO umbrella. But Boston in the mid-70s is a pressure cooker. Racist backlash to school desegregation, economic crisis, a feminist scene that often treats racism as an optional issue, and a gay and lesbian scene where whiteness and maleness still dominate. Over time, it becomes clear that the national NBFO structure is not meeting the intensity of their local reality. The Boston group wants a sharper socialist analysis, an explicitly lesbian-inclusive politics, and a more grounded approach to a working-class life. They find the national organization too tied to middle-class respectability, too cautious, too diffuse. There's no dramatic schism moment with doors slamming and declarations read into microphones. It's more like a gradual shift. Their Boston meetings drift away from NBFO's national agenda and toward the urgent questions in front of them. Eventually, they decide they need to be something else. They become the Combahee River Collective. The name we've already talked about, but it's worth repeating here. Naming themselves after Harriet Tubman's Combahee River raid is not just an aesthetic, it's strategic. They are claiming lineage from a Black woman who planned and led a liberation campaign, not just from generic strong woman vibes. Inside the collective, the work is not glamorous. Most of it happens in living rooms, borrowed church basements, women's centers. People show up tired from their shifts, delayed by buses, dragging kids in grocery bags and half-finished assignments. Meetings begin with the same kind of "how was your week" that could pass for small talk anywhere else. But here, those stories are treated as data. One woman talks about a boss who pays white employees more and calls her girl when she pushes back. Another talks about a landlord who ignores repairs in Black tenants' units, but responds immediately to those of the white tenants. Someone else talks about being closeted at work or enduring endless jokes at family gatherings about how single they are. Another woman brings up a friend's boyfriend who is violent and the impossible choice between calling the cops or leaving him in a community already under siege from the police. Patterns emerge. Race, gender, class, sexuality, state power, they're all entangled in each story. The collective starts to see their weekly check-ins as something more than venting. They're a form of analysis. Barbara Smith later describes it bluntly. When they examined their lives, they found that race, class, sex, and homophobia were all kicking our behinds at the same time. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And you also can't keep pretending that existing organizations, each focused on one head of the Hydra, will somehow accidentally kill the whole monster. So Combahee pushes itself to become more than a support group. They start reading in a more systematic way. Black women's history, Marxist theory, anti-imperialist texts, lesbian feminist writing. They present papers to each other, then to broader audiences. They consider launching a Black feminist publication because they know there are women out there who have never heard anyone name these patterns. And they organize. They work on issues of reproductive health and abuse where Black women are navigating both lack of access to abortion and birth control and the very real threat of coerced sterilization. They talk about opening a shelter for battered women in Black communities, confronting the fact that violence is not just something happening out there in white neighborhoods or from the Klan, but also inside their own communities, with all the complications of calling a racist police force for help. They engage in campaigns around welfare rights, housing, and schooling. They join coalitions, bring Black feminist perspectives into spaces that have not considered them, and sometimes get accused of making everything too complicated. Through it all, the collective is not a slick organization with a PR department. It's people, arguing over theory and over who gets to do the dishes this week. Laughing, crying, making up, breaking up. Somebody is always late. Somebody is always cooking. Somebody is always asking, okay, but what are we going to do about it? Then 1979 happens. Over a period of months, 12 Black women in Boston are murdered. Their deaths do not prompt the citywide anguish and media obsession that similar crimes against white women might have. They are victims, but not, apparently, the right kind of victims. Tale as old as time. For Combahee, this is not an abstract crime statistic. It's a gut punch. In a diary entry, Barbara Smith writes that Black women are dying, and that, at bottom, Black feminism is about keeping Black women from dying. Not metaphorically, literally. You can feel the statement coming at this point, not as an academic exercise, but as a desperate need to pull together everything they have seen and said and screamed into one coherent document that says, this is what is happening to us, this is what we believe, this is what we need. At some point, talking isn't enough. You need a document you can pass across a table and say, start here. At a retreat in the late 1970s, the Combahee River Collective decides to write that document. They aren't trying to invent a grand new philosophy. They're trying to capture in one place what years of meetings, fights, campaigns, and late-night conversations have already taught them. They call it the Combahee River Collective Statement. Putting it in writing matters for three audiences. First, for other Black women. They know there are women like them scattered across the country who are trying to name what's happening in their own lives with no support. A statement can travel where they can't. It can be photocopied, mailed, read in consciousness-raising groups, slipped into a syllabus. Second, for white feminists, Combahee is done with "we didn't realize things were that bad" as an excuse. Once the statement exists, ignorance requires more effort. Third, for history, they've watched earlier Black women's ideas disappear from official stories. Writing under their own names is a way of leaving a trace that's harder to erase. The heart of the statement is their description of interlocking oppression. They describe racism, sexism, class exploitation, and heterosexism as systems that work together, not separately, to shape Black women's lives. They say that the synthesis of these oppressions creates the condition of our lives. In plain language, the world doesn't hit them one blow at a time. A Black lesbian doesn't clock in at work and experience just sexism from her boss, just racism from the hiring committee, and just homophobia when coworkers make comments about her roommate. It's all one experience. You can't tease them apart without lying about how it feels to walk through the day. A Black mother in a housing project dealing with underfunded schools, racist policing, and a clinic that might deny her pain medication while simultaneously pushing her to sterilize herself is not moving through separate, unrelated systems. She is standing at their crossroads. From that reality, Combahee draws a simple conclusion. You can't end any one of these oppressions in isolation and actually free Black women. A racist feminism that ignores class and sexuality won't do it. A homophobic socialism won't do it. A sexist Black nationalism won't do it. This is intersectionality before Kimberly Crenshaw gave it a name. Then they drop the phrase that will have a very long, very weird afterlife: identity politics. In the statement, identity politics means this: we start our politics from the identity and experiences of Black women because no one else has consistently put us at the center. They note that white women's organizations have not historically been reliable defenders of Black women. They note that Black men's organizations have not centered Black women either. Therefore, they say, the most profound and potentially radical politics come directly from our own identity and experience. That's not a demand for special treatment. It's a way of saying people who are getting hit from every direction are uniquely placed to see how the system works. If you build a world where Black lesbians are safe, housed, fed, free to love who they love, and in control of their own bodies, you have to dismantle so many interconnected systems of domination that nearly everyone else benefits too. They weren't saying only Black lesbians matter. They were saying if you can build a world where Black lesbians are safe and free, that world will be good enough for everyone else. This is a huge part of why people find the statement threatening, even if they can't always articulate it. Because if you accept that analysis, you can't build your feminism around the most comfortable women in the room and call it universal. You can't declare racial justice achieved when Black men are visible in leadership and Black women are still being sterilized without consent and murdered without headlines. You can't declare gay rights secure because white cis men can get married while Black trans women are being killed. The statement also looks inward at movements that think of themselves as progressive. It calls out white feminists for refusing to grapple with racism, for assuming that women's issues look the same across race and class. It names the exhaustion of having to explain over and over and over again that racism isn't a side topic. It's the main topic that's woven into everything from hiring decisions to healthcare to whose pain is believed at the hospital. It calls out Black nationalist and civil rights spaces for ignoring sexism and homophobia, for treating Black women's desire to not be subordinated in their own communities as a distraction from the real struggle. And it unabashedly includes lesbianism as a political identity, in a time when being out could cost you your job, your family, and your safety. Combahee refuses to tuck sexuality into the closet for the sake of respectability. Betty Friedan and her fear of the Lavender Menace back in 1969 could never. They break 3 big rules of the 1970s left all at once. Don't call out white feminists, don't call out Black men, and definitely don't put lesbians in your political platform. They do all 3 in a document that is frankly very calm about it. The statement also talks about method. Combahee insists that their analysis comes from life sharing and consciousness raising, from Black women talking about their jobs, families, relationships, and fears, and then collectively naming the patterns. If you were with us for the Quaker episode, you can hear the echo. Quakers believed an inner light could move anyone to speak truth in a meeting, regardless of credentials. Combahee believes that ordinary Black women speaking from experience have the authority to interpret reality and define what justice should look like. Testimony isn't an anecdote, it's part of the theory. Once the statement exists, it starts to travel. Mimeographed copies, anthologies, and of course, readers. By the 1980s and 1990s, it becomes a staple in women's studies and Black studies classrooms. It sometimes gets more respect in the syllabus than it does in the streets, but it's there, quietly rewriting what counts as feminist thought. As an organization, the Combahee River Collective fades out by the early 1980s. There's no dramatic final scene. People move, burn out, take jobs, take care of family, shift into other work. But the statement doesn't fade. It's reprinted in socialist feminist collections in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It shows up in Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology in 1983. It becomes a go-to text for professors trying to explain to students why race plus gender plus class is not just a list, but a lived reality. Meanwhile, in law, Kimberly Crenshaw is writing about Black women plaintiffs who fall through the cracks of anti-discrimination law because the courts only know how to see race discrimination or sex discrimination, not both at once. She coins the term intersectionality to describe the way legal frameworks miss the intersections where they live. She is giving a formal name to the same dynamics Combahee described as interlocking oppressions. In the 1990s, Black women like Loretta Ross and organizations like Sister Song crystallized the concept of reproductive justice, the right to have children, not have children, and raise the children we have in a safe and sustainable community. They explicitly talk about how racism, poverty, environmental harm, and state violence shape reproductive life. Again, it's Combahee's insistence on centering Black women's survival and conditions now built into a movement framework. Queer and trans people of color develop queer of color politics, analyzing how racism, capitalism, gender, and sexuality intersect. They talk about prisons, borders, policing, welfare, family. Their work reads like an extended footnote to Combahee's decision to start from Black women's lives as the most revealing standpoint. Then, in 2013, 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, give us Black Lives Matter. From the beginning, BLM's founding vision is explicitly intersectional. Its statements talk about queer and trans Black people, disabled Black people, undocumented Black people, Black women, and girls. At least 2 of the founders are queer. They built a decentralized, chapter-based network instead of a single charismatic male leader. If you squint, it looks suspiciously like the political future Combahee was imagining, just with smartphones. In 2014, after several high-profile police killings of Black individuals, Kimberly Crenshaw and others launched #SayHerName, a campaign insisting that Black women and girls killed by police or who die in state custody must not be forgotten in narratives that focus almost exclusively on Black men. When you see queer Black women at the center of Black Lives Matter, that's Combahee's ghost in the corner, checking off a box and saying, "Good, somebody read the memo." When you see that hashtag scrolling by on your feed, that's the line about Black feminism being about keeping Black women from dying, coming back with a megaphone. And yet, at the same time, identity politics becomes the villain of a whole other story. In that story, told on op-ed pages and talk shows, identity politics is not a survival strategy, it's a tantrum. It's young people demanding special treatment. It's a threat to universal politics. The women who coined the term were dealing with police neglect, racist violence, low wages, coerced sterilization, homophobia, and sexism. Their version said, start your politics with people catching hell from every direction. The talk show version says, identity politics is when the company adds a pride flag to its logo in June and one of your coworkers asks you not to make racist jokes at staff drinks. If you're used to being the default setting for the people, Combahee's logic feels radioactive, because if you take it seriously, you might have to restructure some stuff. You have to ask your feminism whether it works for women who aren't white, straight, or financially secure. You have to ask your anti-racist work whether Black women and queer and trans Black people are actually safer at the end of it. You have to ask your queer politics whether it includes poor and Black and disabled queer folks or just the ones who look good in a commercial. That's not always comfortable. And that discomfort is exactly why the phrase identity politics gets twisted into a cultural boogeyman. It's easier to claim that marginalized people are obsessed with identity than to admit that you've been building your politics around whoever was already closest to power the entire time. So where does that leave us? The Combahee River Collective scared people because they refused to check any part of themselves at the door. Black, lesbian, feminist, socialist, working class, middle class. They walked that into the room as whole people and said, any politics that can't handle all of me at once isn't liberation, it's just public relations. They did not accept the menu of either or, race or gender, class or sexuality, nation or body. They demanded both and because their lives demanded both and. The original identity politics was not a corporate training module. It was Black women in Boston asking why their murders were not seen as a crisis, why their poverty was treated as personal failing, why their sexuality made them disposable in movements that claimed to be about freedom. So the next time you hear someone spit out identity politics like it's a dirty word, mentally drag the conversation back to that living room. Translate it into Combahee's language. Don't hear politics has all become about identity. Hear people I used to ignore have learned to speak in complete sentences, and I hate that for me. Ask who benefits from keeping universal politics safely centered on people who already have the most. In this arc, Combahee is not alone. Quaker women bet on an inner light and insisted that they were spiritual equals. Joan of Arc terrifies people by showing up as a teenage girl in armor claiming direct access to God and military strategy. Witches are punished for knowing too much, healing too well, stepping outside the script. Girl Scouts quietly train girls to organize, lead, camp, and manage money, which frankly seems to scare men more than any horror film ever made in Hollywood. And here, in a Boston living room, Black lesbian feminists calmly redraw the map of liberation so that it no longer orbits around the most respectable, the most visible, or the most familiar. They put Black women, poor, queer, working, caretaking, exhausted, at the center and say, start here or stop calling it freedom. Whether it's a Quaker woman standing up in a meeting house or a Black lesbian in a Boston apartment, the terror for people in charge is always the same. Women insisting that their experience counts as evidence and that their lives are not a footnote to someone else's revolution. If that makes you a little uncomfortable, good. Sit with it. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend who's been told identity politics is a dirty word, and let Combahee explain what it actually meant. You can find more deep dives, rants, and historical side quests over on my Substack, Bitchy History. Subscribing, sharing, and leaving a review wherever you listen really does help keep this show going. Next time, we're headed back to the 19th century to meet with Matilda Jocelyn Gage, a woman who made the churches, the state, and even her fellow suffragists deeply uncomfortable by asking who gets to write the story of freedom in the first place. I'm Professor Meredith, and this has been Bitchy History.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?